all. Yes, it is quite late at night for me or early in the morning, but it's always good to be here and see all your faces. Just going to talk quickly about a couple of projects we've been doing lately on these really cool ants, which we have lucky to have in Australia. So they're called weaver ants. They do all sorts of fascinating, cool collective behaviours, one of which is self-assembly. So this is where they join their bodies together to make different structures to perform different functions for the colony. So one of those structures is called hanging chains. It acts like a rope ladder for other ants to climb down to get to a platform. They also form bridges across gaps, which they direct their foraging trails across. And these bridges can be either small or large, depending on the traffic that they have to accommodate. And they grab onto each other in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. Use a mandible to neck connection. Sometimes their antennae get in there, but they're extremely functional structures, and mostly because they're very grippy. So they have these hooks on their feet, tarsal claws, but they also have an inflatable pad in the middle called an aurolium, which they pump hemolymph into. It kind of acts like a gecko's foot, gives them a really powerful grip. And they use that to their advantage with these structures greatly. So one of the first things we wanted to look at was these hanging chains, because they're a really robust behavior and easy to get in the lab. Now, this was work done by my PhD student, Daniela Carlesso, who's just about to submit his PhD thesis. What we wanted to look at with these structures was I look at the cost-benefit trade-off, essentially, and they're kind of a bit different to other structures in this way. So there's obviously a cost to the ants in building these structures, and that cost is the number of ants that get locked up in the structure and can't perform other tasks for the colony. And they do get a benefit, but in this case, the benefit's not actually known to the ants what it's going to be until they get down to the platform below and check it out. There could be food there, it could be a great resource, or there could just be nothing, and they've wasted all this time and energy in ants that could be doing other things. So really the ants have to sort of have a gamble on how much they're going to invest before they get to know what the payoff could be. So we've looked at two ways of understanding this. One, the behavioural analysis, looking at what are the individual level mechanisms, and also how do they regulate these things and the costs. And we did that through a mixture of behavioural analysis and analytical modelling. So this is essentially the setup. It's simply put some ants in a box with a platform that they can get to by forming a chain. And they pretty readily do this, get to the end, grab onto each other and form a chain going down. So we did a whole bunch of these for different gap heights, ranging from, I think, we did essentially 5 to 50 millimeters in different sizes that the ants had to cross. And then just filmed them and measured a whole bunch of things. So for different heights from the platform, what was the ants' distance to the visual target from the end of the chain, the length of the chain, the traffic arriving and leaving from the chain tip, and the rate of ants joining per second, all of these things to try to see what influenced the ants' decisions to join and leave the structure. The first kind of question was, okay, where do they join and leave? And this slide is really to convince you that pretty much everything's happening at the tip of the chain. There's not much happening anywhere else. So the vast majority of ants join within one ant length, which is about 10 millimeters of the tip of the chain. And same for leaving. Very few ants leave once the chain has grown beyond them and they're now stuck in the structure. So we actually use this to isolate most of our analyses to this region around the tip of the chain where all the action is happening. Interestingly, we found absolutely no effect of any of the things we measured on the ants joining probability. Looks like they just join chains with a constant probability of around 60%, regardless of the distance from the platform, the traffic going up and down, or anything else that we measured. This is kind of very different to other things we've seen, like with army ants, for instance, where the formation and things happening in the structures are really heavily influenced by traffic. But it doesn't seem like it's the case for the ants' decision to join the structure here. But the opposite is true of the leaving decisions. So there is an effect of traffic going down onto the chain tip, where the more ants going down, the less likely ants that are in the chain tip are to leave. And if there's a lot of ants leaving, then the more likely they are to detach from the structure and join that traffic as well. But by far the biggest effect was the ants in the structure their distance to the platform below. So whenever they were close to the platform, they were had a very low chance of leaving the structure. If they were further from the platform, they just left. So they're kind of forming constantly and then deciding whether to stay there or not based mostly on their distance to the platform below. And they can do this with their vision because they have quite good vision, especially for ants. So we wanted to look at, is this simple mechanism, by far the biggest effect on what we saw, is this enough to actually prevent colonies investing in chains that are too costly, so they're not paying too high costs when they're having these gambles? So to get at that, we did an analytical model, which was pretty simple, just looking at that the size of the chain over time is going to be mostly influenced by the number of ants joining minus the number of ants leaving. And we could reformulate that as the number of ants joining is the traffic arriving at the chain multiplied by the probability of joining, which is constant. This is all generated from the experimental data. And the number of ants leaving is the current size of the chain in terms of number of ants multiplied by the proportion of ants which leave the chain per time step. And we calculated that by our survival analyses from the data on how often the ants left based on their distance from the target. So that depends purely on their distance from this target below the chain. So we ran a whole heap of these simulations and we used traffic that was extracted from the experiments as well and grouped at 10-second intervals to sort of get more of a realistic approach to it. Important thing is we did two versions of the model. One where the proportion of ants leaving the chain changes as a function of their distance, just as we saw in the experiments. And an alternative where we kept that constant, so they weren't actually leaving based on that distance, to see how closely that matched our data as well. So for these three distances of 25, 35, and move my thing, 50 millimeters from the platform, we see the number of ants in the chain grows over time. That's our data from the experiments. And the variable model matches that really closely. So we saw this and thought, this is awesome, fantastic. But the alternative model where we didn't have the ants modulating their leaving probabilities also fits the data really well. So this was a little bit disappointing. We're like, okay, what's going on here? And so we thought, well, maybe it's just that over these target distances, about 50 millimeters that we tested, it's just not enough of a distance for the ants to actually bother modulating their decisions. They'll always pay the cost and take the gamble over such a short distance. So we turned to simulation modeling to see and test a much larger range of traffic and gap heights than we could test in the lab, economically at least. And this is the results for the variable model, and this is the results for the alternative model. So here is where you see the really big difference. Over the gap heights that we were testing, which were up to 50 millimeters, there's really not much of a difference in the two models. But the obvious difference is at the larger gaps. So for anything over about 9 centimeters, the variable model predicts the ants will just never build chains. Whereas the alternative model, they will continue building chains over these larger gaps. So using this information, we went back to the lab and tested at these distances. So we took 6 more colonies of workers, used identical setups as before, and now tested them with an 11 centimeter gap. Again, the variable model shows the ants should never build chains. The alternative, they should always. In this case, of all of the colonies we tested, they never formed any chains for this larger gap. And just to make sure the ants weren't being lazy, we then immediately tested these same colonies with a 35 millimeter gap, and all of those colonies built chains then. So this was kind of the clincher, the real proof that we were pretty sure that what we were looking at was correct. And just to make double sure, we got really mean with the ants and decided to trick them by having a moving platform. So now we always kept the platform within 2 centimeters of the end of the chain, and now we can get them to go up to 12 centimeters or even longer if we wanted to. So that was really nice bit of final evidence that it's a pretty simple decision rule the ants are using, just modulating how often they leave the chains and basing that on how close they are to the platform. And they're able to use that to avoid paying massive costs when they might not get a payoff. So that was really cool. And there's a little bit more to be done with the hanging chains, I think, but this was a really nice start on that stuff. The other really cool behavior that the ants do, and this is pretty much entirely unique to weaver ants, is the formation of these pulling chains. So they nest up in the trees, and when they do, they pull leaves together and then use their larvae to produce silk and stitch those leaves together into a big ball. And that's where they nest up in the trees. There's always been a really question on why they make these chains. So these pulling chains are just ants that join onto each other in a long line and make these, basically act like winches and pull together. And it's kind of unclear why they would do this and whether they would gain a huge benefit from joining up together, whereas those same ants could help in other ways. So we wanted to really get down and look at what's going on in the forces generated inside these pulling chains. So this is work done by a master's student, Maddie, who's unfortunately left the lab. She was fantastic. And it turns out that looking at coordinating this team effort in even something as simple as a pulling task isn't quite as straightforward as you would think. So if we program robots to do this together, then every time you add a robot, it's programmed to add the same amount of force, then you get the same amount of force per agent, regardless of how many agents are coordinating in a team. That makes a lot of sense, and that's the way it should be, but it turns out this is not the way that humans work. We're actually rubbish at this task. It's called the Ringelmann effect. Basically, in this tug-of-war kind of scenario, the more humans you add, you actually get less force output per human as the team grows. It's put down to two main factors. One, potentially just a coordination thing. We're not very good at timing our pulls together as a team, and so we actually may end up maybe cancelling some of the forces out or just not coordinating very well. And the other factor, which I think is probably more of a factor, is social loafing. So as people see that they're part of a bigger team, they simply put in less effort. Whereas if they're a part of a smaller team, they might have a little bit more effort than they would as part of a bigger one. So since ants are both really good at coordinating their behaviors and far less selfish than humans, we thought maybe there's a chance that we could see the opposite effect, some kind of social facilitation where the more ants are involved in their team effort, that actually the more effort they put in per individual. So to test this, we got the ants to basically took them out of the field, got them to just try to nest inside these paper teardrop leaves and film from above. So the leaf was attached to a load cell, so we could measure how much force the team of ants was exerting on the tip of that leaf as they were pulling for each time point. And also we could look at, okay, what was the composition and number of ants pulling? So how many single ants were pulling by themselves, how many 2-ant chains and 3-ant chains in this whole group, and you can get the force the whole team exerted. So how did it go? Remember, this is the line for robots and for humans, and what do the ants do? Awesome. Social facilitation, it looks like. So we've got this really nice positive correlation where the more ants you add, the larger force you actually get per individual coming out, which is really cool. And when you drill down further into this, it's not just the total number of ants, it's actually the average chain size. So the more long chains you have, the more force you get per individual. And this actually has a much larger total effect than just the total number of ants. So this is really kind of cool, which shows this may actually be the purpose of these long chains, is that somehow they allow this social facilitation to happen, whereby the whole team ends up pulling with more force per individual than when the long chains aren't present. So we wanted then to look at what's going on in the long chains. So if you have a line of ants, are they all kind of pulling the same amount of force, or just some positions in the chain end up pulling with more force? So to get at this, we got single ants to pull on the load cell, so we could see what force a single ant was exerting, and then looked at the postures. So we knew that when ants were pulling really hard, it was clear that they were doing two things. One was putting their back legs far out behind them and in line with their body. And this actually showed up really well in the force diagram. So when the legs were extended really far from their body and in line with the long axis of the body, that was the posture that the ants had when they were exerting the most force on the load cell. So now we can go back to see, okay, what are the legs doing on each of the ants in each position in these long chains? So when we have single ants or 2 ants in a chain and looking at the postures of each ant in each of these chains, it does look like the further you get back in the chain, the more likely an ant is to be adopting one of these postures that's associated with large force output. So it's the ants at the back of the chain that are actually exerting more force than other ants in other positions. So I can't say with 100% certainty that we're really locked in on the mechanism of social facilitation. It could be just that the ants at the back of the chain have more room to put their legs behind them because there's no ants behind them. Or it could be that they're maybe a little bit more updated on the information of the total group effort because they're the ones who have joined more recently. I don't know how we can get at that, but I think we're kind of almost getting there, which is really cool. So we have a whole bunch of stuff planned to do with robots as well, using these rules that we extract from various experiments in pulling chain and collective transport experiments as well. So we're trying to build something like this and see what we can do with robots. Because the next big project really is looking at collective construction. And this is where the money is coming from now. So my big sell is that construction is kind of an awful industry. Wouldn't it be awesome if we had teams of robots who could do stuff for us? But we're actually really bad at programming robots to build as a team. We don't know how to do it. Who does it really well? Ants, right? So weaver ants build huge nests. We've just come back from Townsville. We spent a week collecting ants, and we had some that were as big as a beach ball with probably hundreds of thousands of ants inside. And they do it by pulling the leaves together and then stitching them with the silk from the larvae, using them like glue guns, basically, to stitch the leaves together. But what we didn't know until we started keeping them in the lab was inside any kind of void they're nesting in, they also build floors and tunnels and galleries and all kinds of crazy corkscrew structures using the silk from the larvae. Basically 3D printing things as a team. So we want to figure out how they do that and 3D image that process from start to finish. And we're developing a photogrammetry setup to do that now, which is almost ready to go. So hopefully we can get an idea of how that's done because they're really neat structures. And then look at possibly topology, maybe topography, any kind of metric of what the nests are like. So then we can do some comparative experiments. So very simple things like keeping the size and shape of the void that they're filling the same, but adding different numbers of ants. Similarly, having the same number of ants, changing the void shape, and seeing if these things result in different structures, or whether the ants are using rules which build basically the same structure regardless of the number of ants or the void they're filling. Similarly, the void shape can be kept the same in terms of volume, but changed in different areas and made different inside. Ideally, we would combine this with complete tracking of all the individuals in this 3D space. Obviously, we're going to have a massive amount of occlusion. It's going to be really difficult. But we are trying to develop these really cool QR codes with Tim Landgraf's group, adapting them from honeybees for use in the weaver ants. And we're kind of almost getting there. It's a very difficult thing to do, but we're almost getting there. This is a couple of ants making a bridge across this gap. We're trying to track all the individuals and their interactions to see what the rules are for building these bridges. Hopefully, when all those things come together, we can start to think about how do we get some robots to do something like 3D printing together as a swarm without being programmed what to do. They can just sort of structure arises from the local interaction rules that we get from the ants. That's the big aim. Maybe it's 5-10 years down the track. And if anyone has any ideas, I'd be welcome to hear your thoughts on it. So thanks very much for listening, everyone.